Good everyone, it's Studio. Today we have another episode in the daily test lineups, and today we're going to be taking looks at the USSR, aka the Soviets. This is going to be a fun one, and it's definitely going to be one where I'm sure people will be asking questions in the, shall we say, the vehicles down below. But as per usual with this series, this is meant to be a bare bones lineups. In other words, something you can get to very early on in your War Thunder career. So what that means is, throughout the vehicles, I will be explaining potential upgrades to them, while sticking in the rank 2 metric. So of course, in some cases, like the KV-1, there isn't really a valid upgrade, because the only one that is rank 3 and slightly over-tiered, but I digress. That's how obviously this series works. If you have any of your own suggestions, what you think could maybe work its way into the lineup with the selected vehicles, please do let me know. But personally, this is just what I would go with if I was a newer player. And, it's more like to suggest to a newer player is what I should say. So we'll start off as per usual, but before I do, I just want to quickly elaborate on some of the vehicles. Russia is one of, I believe, 3 nations that actually gets a heavy tank, so they can actually do the rank 2 heavy tank test. So that is something, and obviously a new player can easily get to that and will definitely help them out when it comes to it. But anyway, without further ado, let's get in and discuss the first vehicle, which is of course the legendary T-34 1941. Probably one of the most recognisable vehicles in War Thunder, I'll be honest, the T-34 is. And this one is no exception. This takes the L10, I think it's the L10? No, or is it the L11? I can't remember. I'm getting on a bit in terms of my brain some days. Like, I know I'm only 23, but Jesus Christ, my memory's not that bad. Like, not the best. But to be fair, with how many vehicles in War Thunder there are, yeah, I do tend to forget one or two things. So, yeah. The T-34 1941 takes that gun, swaps it out for an F-34 cannon, which is a perfectly acceptable gun for the 3.7 BR. Now, of course, you will run into things in an up tier that you will really struggle with, especially when stock. But generally, this gun can crack most things it comes across pretty comfortably. And it's definitely a solid all-round vehicle in terms of armor, its mobility, and its overall just survivability. And it definitely does have what a new player is looking for. Of course, with the sloped armor, it does have very good survivability, especially when angled like this. But of course, you've got to consider the turret cheeks and the cannon breech itself. These are very obvious weak spots. 99% of players will know where to shoot these now, so don't rely on your armor all the time. It will not always save you. But the fact is, this tank is one of the best and will definitely get you through most rank 2 daily tasks that you can come across. And if you want a potential upgrade for this vehicle, which you would have to up-tier yourself a bit, you can obviously, you do have to go into a folder, and is it the L11? It was the L11. See, I'm not that bad. But if you want a potential upgrade to the T-34 1941 to maybe bolster your lineup, you can go with the 1942, which is essentially the tank that you have with a slightly better turret, or you can go down the extra armor route and have the ESTZ. But of course, you still have the weak turret, so just bear that in mind when it comes to that. If you want a better turret, you go to 1942. If you want better hull armor, which it's only on the front, spoiler alert, you can potentially go for that as well. But this tank is really solid. I mean, a 500 horsepower engine and a 28.1 ton tank, propelling this thing to a top speed of 30 miles an hour. In other words, I could drive down my local street with this and still keep up with traffic. It's actually really fast, and for a tank, it definitely does make up its mobility. Now, luckily, it's quite unlikely you're actually going to get ammo racked, so your ammunition is mostly stored in the hull floor. There are a few shells along the side near the fuel tanks, but the fuel tanks tend to eat shots anyway, and it is quite hilarious when you are in this tank and someone's shell gets eaten by the fuel tank, but when you're fighting these little bastards, it is definitely not fun when your shell gets eaten by the fuel tank and you die to this 76mm. Speaking of that 76mm, you're going to want to bum rush to this round as soon as you can. BR350B, 100.1 grams of TNT equivalent. This is definitely a solid all-round shell, But of course, if you want a little bit more punch in terms of pen, you really just, I mean, it's not by much, but this has better just overall penetration at distance. This does lack the APCR that the later T-34s get, so just bear that in mind. But the fact is, you should be pretty fine with just these 2 rounds. And, well, as I said, the potential upgrades are there if you wish, but personally, this lineup is pretty solid even without those upgrades. Moving on to the tank that you don't necessarily have to upgrade, but you can if you want, if you're upgrading the T-34 anyway. We have the KV-1L11. This was a nightmare for me back in the day. When I was a new player, I'm going back, so some of you might think I'm seeing it in black and white or something. I don't know. I know some people think I'm old, but, you know. For context, I started playing Warzone when I was 15 years old. Well, I say 15, more like 14 and a half, if you want to be precise. And this is definitely something where I had fond memories, but also hateful memories of this tank. Needless to say, when you're a new player and your Shermans are stock, and you have to fight these things, yeah, not exactly fun, because you can barely scratch these buggers. I mean, you could go for the turret, but, well, back then I didn't know that. And yeah, this thing was basically a rolling pillbox back in the day, and it lived up to that reputation very well. Obviously, over the years, it's definitely lost that touch, but it's still a pretty solid heavy tank. Now, of course, in terms of the shells, you'll notice it's a lot worse than the T-34 1941s by a decent margin, but with access to a APBC round, which should definitely help you out in terms of the penetration at up close and personal, this tank is good. Like I said, it's got very good armor for what it is. Obviously, it does have this machine gun port weak spot now, which it didn't used to back in the day. This never existed. And of course, the driver's hatch weak spot is pretty well known. The flat spot here of the turret is also pretty well known. So the KV will obviously protect you for the most part, but of course, against an experienced player, they know how to pick this thing apart. So make sure to angle your armor like this, because then obviously your side armor is 75mm as well. But if you're angling like this, you have potential of your tracks eating a shot, you have your turret potentially bouncing a shot if they're going for the here, and they miss by like here. There's all sorts of things you can do to definitely help the KV-1 survivability. But obviously if you're upgrading the T-34 1941, which I do suggest you do, you can obviously upgrade per se to the KV-1S. Now, you do trade some armor with this tank, and that's not why I've put it in the lineup originally, because the KV-1S does trade quite a bit of side armor, quite a bit of hull armor in most areas, and of course does sort of upgrade in the turret area a little bit, but it's not to the point where you're going to have an indestructible tank. The KV-1S is a lot easier to kill than the KV-1L11. That's just my experience from it. But of course, you do gain a better gun, which is pretty much the same as the T-34s. So it's really down to what you prefer. And of course, this tank is a lot quicker than the KV-1L11. Same engine, but of course, nearly 4 tons lighter definitely does make quite a difference. So if you are upgrading to the T-34s, I would suggest putting this in your lineup for a upgrade. And of course, having a better gun is no harm in itself, but the fact that it loses 4 tons of weight and basically goes like a sports car for a heavy tank, yeah, I would definitely take that trade, but obviously, as a newer player, I would give you this, personally, just to start you off. But as I said, if you're upgrading the T-34 anyway, this is definitely a good starting point. Moving on to the tank destroyer, now this was a little bit tricky because Russia doesn't really have many good tank destroyers. We have the Su-122. Probably one of the most infamous little clubbers that you can have, really. This tank has a 122mm howitzer. It's the biggest gun we've actually had in this little series so far, and it's probably going to remain the biggest. This is definitely a tank where it's a T-34 chassis. It's a little bit heavier than a T-34, but does still keep up that pace. But of course, the one thing that is a little bit tougher on newer players is the reload rate. Obviously, this is on a rather unskilled crew, but it's still 21.5 seconds. Now, if I was to put this on my more experienced crew, if I was to go to crew, so I can just demonstrate, I'll go to tank loader, and as you can see, at the top, it is 18.2 seconds. Now, of course, I do have some points into weapon reloading, but my crew generally on this vehicle does around 19 seconds, and that's still a long time. And of course, with this thing having weak spots, such as the driver's hatch, the right side of the gun, and obviously the big fat gun breech itself, this is definitely something where it's a vehicle that's very situational, but if you get that right situation, it is a beast, and it will definitely do some work for you. Now, of course, being a casemate, it is definitely one of the more trickier vehicles to use, because obviously it doesn't have a turret. But the fact is, if you're playing this vehicle, you're already learning quite a bit from it anyway, so hopefully this vehicle teaches you a lot. In terms of a potential upgrade, there isn't really many candidates, unfortunately, in the rank 2 metric. Now, of course, if you want a gun that's a little bit easier to use, you can go with the YAG-10. Now, this is a truck base, so this is a lot less armoured. Well, armour is a strong word on this vehicle, let's put it that way. But the fact is obviously with it being a truck, this is, well, it is slower than the chassis that you've currently got here, but of course you do get a 3K 76mm anti-aircraft gun, which doesn't have HEVT before anyone jumps to that conclusion. It does, however, have a very nasty armor-piercing high explosive round, which can pretty much nuke anything it pens, and with decent penetration, it will definitely do that. The issue is, however, is this vehicle is quite cumbersome to put into position. It's obviously very, very poorly armoured. Most of it is the chassis of the truck itself, and that isn't really much. And of course, this vehicle is extremely vulnerable to aircraft. So if you are going to upgrade to this, I would strongly suggest learning your maps, and most importantly, positioning. If you don't want that, and you want something that's a little bit more forgiving in terms of using its gun, there are two options, but I'm going to suggest this one, the Su-57B, which back in the day, this thing was god-awful. 4.0 BR when this thing first came out. Absolutely awful. Nowadays, a 2.7, it can do a lot more work. Whilst it isn't exactly a armoured casemate, it is definitely a much more forgiving gun with the 57mm. And good news is, if you're going down the 57mm choice, you'll get some practice for the T-34 57, which you'll eventually use in a rank 3 lineup, which, don't worry, that will be featured in the upcoming rank 3, so to speak, when that eventually comes, because obviously I'm going to do all the nations that I give a crap about, apart from Israel, and do that first, and then we'll move on to the rank 3s. But if I was to personally suggest, if you want more practice with the 57, this is definitely your tank destroyer. It obviously doesn't have the punch of the Su-122 or the YAG-10, but the penetration is really good. 145mm at 10 meters, or millimeters at 10 meters, not 145 meters. I'd be very worried if a gun could pen that much, but you get my point. The fact is that this vehicle is not the most survivable, so don't expect it to be, but it's enough to get into a location, it's good at sniping, and it can easily penetrate anything it come across. So, yeah, I would personally suggest this. But of course, the Su-122 is a bit more forgiving, and the Su-57B is in a bracket, so it's really down to you. Moving on to the anti-aircraft vehicle, we have the BTR-152A. Now, I know that a lot of people, because you've probably jumped ahead to this point if you're a Russian main, and you're probably thinking, oh, why are you not suggesting the 94KM ZIS-12? It's such a better anti-aircraft vehicle. I'm going to stop you right there and I'm going to explain. So the reason why I've not picked that truck as opposed to the BTR is for two simple reasons. One is the survivability, which personally is a bit more of a choice, so to speak, because obviously a lot of the time you're going to be getting strafed by cannon anyway, but at these sorts of BRs, a lot of people still use machine guns, and some of them even light machine guns. This thing at least has some degree of protection from light machine guns across the actual truck itself. Well, it's an APC, but you get my point. Of course, the open part is still valid, but of course, with a lot of the areas being protected by this massive turret mount, it's definitely something where you can still have some degree of survivability. Now, of course, the reason why I've picked the BTR as well is due to its overall better driving characteristics. The BTR is a much nicer vehicle to drive than the ZIS 12, at least in my opinion. Because when you slam on the anchors in this thing, it tries to do a slide. And not being funny, right? If I wanted to go and do slides, I do Need for Speed Underground in a Evo 9, and that's coming from me. The fact is that this vehicle is not nice to drive for a new player. Whilst it does have better penetration by a country mile, the fact is, I would personally give a new player a bit more survivability. Now, sure, you can upgrade to the ZIS 12, sure, if they want to do that, but that's why I'm suggesting the BTR. It's a solid all-rounder, it has pretty good survivability, actually better survivability than the ZIS 12. And whilst it is heavier and slower, it does definitely have the little bit of armor protection that can sometimes keep it alive. So for a newer player, this is definitely where I'd look at. But if they're a player that's actually gained some experience, they're definitely going to want the ZIS 12. I personally use this thing quite a lot, but obviously I'm a relatively experienced player, so yeah, it's really down to you. Now let's move on to the planes. Obviously, planes are very important in a tank lineup, and as per usual, we have two. Which, well, if I didn't include this one, I could practically hear Harry grabbing his pitchfork and torches at this point. So I've picked the IL-2 1942. Now, of course, this is a vehicle where, if we go to the aviation side, it is a little bit further down than the 1941, but trust me, it is worth the patience to get the 1942. The 1941 is a solid all-rounder. It does do pretty much everything this aircraft does, but it does have worse ground attack cannons. It has the Shavak, which is more than enough to deal with most things. But we want bigger is better, don't we? Because let's be real, most people like bigger guns. And well, the IL-2 1942 is definitely packing that, with the Armoured Target's 23mm bell. With 46mm of penetration at 10 meters, you will never get that. The fact is, at most distances, you will be packing a severe punch, and even if you're at like 300 meters from a tank, in which case you're probably going in for a kamikaze run, the fact is, you can actually pen a lot of tanks from the side and above with these cannons, and because they're cannons, they shrapnel quite nicely, and they will butcher crew on the inside of a tank. And with custom loadouts on this vehicle, you can definitely mix and match and make this thing how you want it. Obviously, you can't do bombs in the internal bay and then the 250s, but of course, having access to rockets and overall decent-sized bombs, this thing is very versatile. Now, of course, the one thing that I wish guys would do is take the inspiration from IL-2 Sturmovik, which, if you've never played that game, fair enough. I've not played it myself, but I've seen gameplay of it. The fact is that they cut out a piece here and they put a 50 cal rear gun in. I would love this to be like a field modification for the aircraft, same with the 41, but I don't think we're ever going to get that, but I digress. The fact is, though, this thing is good enough for an attack aircraft. It can definitely handle itself, and well, what can I say? It's a bit of a beast. But of course, an attacker is no use without its fighter. And this is where the Yak 1 comes in. Now, for the IL-2, you don't really have I'm going to quickly jump back to the IL-2 briefly. There isn't really an upgrade for this vehicle. I'm just going to state that right now. For some reason, the slide is not working. There we go. For an attack aircraft, there isn't really much of an upgrade. If you want something that actually does have a rear gun and sticks in the rank 2 metric, you do have the P3 Biz, which does have custom loadouts, which, as you can see, I've had a little play with, but it's nothing special, to say the least. As you can see, it's definitely one where you have to kind of consider what it is, like, as an aircraft. So, as you can see, you can't do... Let me just take this off. You can't do 6 rockets and then 250 kilogram bombs, which is quite disappointing. But the fact is that you can load this thing up with 100s and rockets and go to town, really. You can obviously take the RBS rockets, but you will have to adjust your payload because obviously it's slightly over on its exceeding weight. But the fact is that the high explosive rockets on this plane are pretty good anyway, but Personally, I wouldn't upgrade to this if I was a newer player. Maybe at a push, but that's how I see it. So back to the Yak 1. This is definitely one where it's a very good aircraft, and obviously I've picked it purely for the bombs. It is definitely a more forgiving aircraft for its bombing capabilities, so to speak, but of course the guns are a little bit weaker than something further down the line. Now, of course, being a Yak, it is relatively maneuverable, it is very fast, and it does have a good climb rate, but it is very vulnerable to fires, even though this thing puts more out than I can think. But we'll gloss over that, because as an experienced player, you tend to just deal with Yaks by shooting the engine anyway. And as you'll see in a Hudson video, I deal with one of these things by doing exactly that. They don't like engine fires, but they love fuel tank fires because they always put them out. But I digress. This thing does get 2 100 kilogram bombs, and obviously it does get a Shavak, so it does have some degree of ground attack potential. But, of course, with its overall performance, I don't really see a need to upgrade this thing. But obviously, as you go further into BRs, this thing will become more outdated as time goes on. So as a result, there are a few options to consider. Now, I'm going to give you the easier option to upgrade to, and that is the Yak 7B. Basically, a Yak 1 with a bit less bombing capability, but a bit more offensive firepower. And then I'm also going to give you one which I think new players might enjoy a little bit more. And that's the Yak 9B. I've sung my praises about this plane for a long time now. And trust me, this thing is worth the upgrade. It's essentially a normal Yak 9, but instead of the fact that the Yak 9 normal can't carry bombs, this has an internal bomb bay with 4 100 kilogram bombs. Trust me, the amount of people I've annoyed because they think it's a regular Yak 9 and think, oh, my tank is safe from that. And next thing you know, I drop a 100 kilogram bomb square in their lap, is quite surprising. So personally, this is one I would definitely try to go for if I was a newer player and wanted to stick to the rank 2 metric for a lineup to do their daily tasks. This thing will definitely help with that, and it can bring some good cast to the table. But of course, if you want something that's a little less capable but has a bit more offensive firepower, you can go with an Ishak, which is a little less durable, and of course it does have limited belts. But if you want something with a bit more punch, you can go for an LA5. Without further ado, I'm going to leave it at that for today. I really hope you enjoyed seeing this lineup. Next up will be Great Britain at rank 2. Anyway, I'm going to leave you all to it for today, and I'll see you all on the next one.